Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Welcome everyone to MOSh, evening of sacred storytelling. Hiya, 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 Chag Sameach. Tziva lanu Moshe. Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov. Ay, 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 Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov, Morasha kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu. Put your hands together. Ay, 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 la, 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 ay, 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 la, 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 ay, 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 la, 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 ay, 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 la, la, la. Morasha kehilat Yaakov, 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 Morasha kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Welcome, 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 welcome everyone to Minyan Oneg Shabbat. Welcome to the Zumagog. Welcome to Sinai. I recognize each and every one of you from there, because we were all standing together there, were we not? And then we got dispersed to California and to Boulder, Colorado, which is a state unto itself. We got dispersed to Pennsylvania and California and Texas and Georgia. As a matter of fact, these are some of the places our storytellers come from this evening. We have 5 storytellers from 5 different locations. Where? Good question. I'm glad you asked. First of all, Renee and I, oh, by the way, I'm Rabbi Mark. Welcome. We are in Washington, D.C. Oh, I forgot. It's not a state. But we're working on that. We have Rabbi Dan Goldblatt from Danville, California. And, you know, when I introduce somebody, you might want to go like this. This is the way we show our gratitude here at Minyan Oneg Shabbat. All the way from Texas, we have Rabbi Dante. Where is he? Dan Gordon. So we have 2 Dans with us here this evening. So we got California, we have Texas, we have Shulamit Fagan, who of course is a Moshnik from Pennsylvania, soon to be back in Florida with her beloved penguins. I said penguin, it's not a penguin, it's a whatever it is. All right, stop spotlighting me, it's very distracting. There we go. And who else is here? Who else is telling? Rick Stone from Decatur, Georgia. Hey, Rick, welcome. And I think that covers everybody. I think I got everybody. So again, welcome. We'll be doing some singing in between stories, and I'll have a story or two to tell as well. If you drift off during any part of the evening and you want to see it at a later time, it'll be posted on our YouTube channel pretty soon, maybe even by this Friday. If you're not already on our regular mailing list and want to know more about this amazing Zumagog, we are exclusively an online community. Yes, we do get together in person twice a year, which is always so delicious. But for the most part, we're on Zoom every Shabbos morning, several times a week for meditation and teachings on Wednesday night. It is truly a blessing. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first storyteller. Our first storyteller is Rabbinic Pastor Shulamit Fagan. Shulamit's a dynamic teacher, a vibrant storyteller, a mother and a grandmother, and about to move from Pennsylvania to Florida, which might be the most important thing going on in her life right now. She teaches naturally and locally on pastoral counseling, decisions at the end of life, ethical wills, and the art of compassionate listening. And maybe, and if I'm adding another most important thing, she is co-founder of the Multi-Faith Storytelling Institute, along with me and Renee. So without further ado, please welcome Shulamit Fagan.
Hi, everybody. Oh my goodness, it's so exciting to be here. And this is such a lovely place to be, isn't it? Okay, I'm the first storyteller, so I'm going to begin right now. Shavuot is the holy day when we all stood at Sinai and Moses received the Torah. Most of you already know that part. It is said that the mountain shook violently with God's presence and that the people could hear the lightning and taste the thunder. It is the day of revelation. This is how it was for me, just a little different when I was coming out of Egypt. We had been in the desert for quite a while. I actually lost track of time, mostly because it seemed like it wasn't necessary. The cloud told us everything to do. We only move when the cloud moves. Everything is provided for us. We lack nothing. And yet, I don't know, there's sort of a restlessness happening. Besides the cloud, and sometimes people tell me the cloud is really God, we have Moses telling us what to do, interpreting God for us, if you will. And of course, there's my husband. He's a good man. He's kind. He's generous. But yeah, he tells me what to do also. I'm at the bottom of the heap. Good for making babies, good for caring for them, and for following orders. The restlessness grows. My sister whispers, "We are all to go stand at the mountain tonight so that Moses can talk to God." Or at least that's what I thought she said. Just asking. I'm sorry, I lost track of where I was. When we were in Egypt, I started talking to God, or at least the image of God that I have. Now, I didn't tell anybody that I was doing this, especially my husband. I don't think anybody else would understand. They would say, "How can you be talking to God?" But I do. And when I'm here, I follow the crowd and I follow Moses and I do what I was told to do. Before long, however, it is no longer gossip. We must all gather, men, women, children, at the foot of the mountain. We are instructed to bathe and wear our finest robes. There is a sense of expectation, a heightened level of fear. I say fear because many of us here are afraid. We've only been out of Egypt a little while. I don't know, should we trust what's going on? Will there always be manna? Many of us just sort of aren't sure. At any rate, we made a lovely sight marching to the mountain. Someone started a beautiful chant, and it grows and it encompasses all of the families around us. As I'm chanting, I feel my body straighten up and my feet hit the ground with growing confidence. Approaching the mountain, my young daughter is astonished at its height and its beauty. I see a golden light surrounding the entire mountain, glowing with what feels to me like the love I have for my daughter times 1,000. It's really quite amazing. I'm engulfed in that love and light as the ground seems to just gently rock. I'm not afraid. My feet are firmly planted and my heart is open. the most beautiful field of flowers appears, flowers that I can feel without touching, sounds that I can hear through my nose. And then a voice says, "This is where you live." It will look different with your physical eye, but this is where you live. You are good and whole and worthy of the spark of me that lives in you. Fan that spark with gratitude, and I will fill your heart with love and your life with joy. The next thing I remember, we were all walking back to our tents. All the people around me are talking about how frightened they were because the ground shook so violently and they could see thunder and hear lightning. The mountain seemed to be consumed by fire. Moses finally came down, bringing new rules and new regulations. You might imagine my wonder at the differences between my experience and the other ones that I heard. As much as I love my husband, there are things I don't talk with him about. And it wasn't until later that month, sitting with my sisters in the tent, that I felt safe enough to ask what their experience was like. I knew from the looks on their faces around me that some might also have had different experiences. "The butterflies were so beautiful," she said softly. "Luminescent, golden. I could smell the moon. The most intimate smell came from it, inviting me closer. And the air, well, the air just tasted like love." The voice of a woman with the most ethereal presence whispered, "I am Shekhinah, and I am Sophia, and I am you. Move out in strength and love." My heart just cried out in joy. I wasn't alone. Some of my holy sisters had gentle experiences of brilliant luminosity, of birds that whisper wisdom, and trees that offer strength. And through all of it, in all of it was love. Well, we talked for hours. We sat together and evoked that love star right there among us. We prayed great gratitude and sang praise. We wondered how such different experiences could happen at the same time in the same place. And then we returned to gratitude and love and wonder. We are living our truth, the truth that we experienced. May we all know our truth and live into it with love. The one constant in all our stories is love.
Thank you, Shulamit.
Thank you.
Ahava Rabba Avtanu. Being receptacles of love, perhaps that is each of our unique mission here in this lifetime. Rabbi Dan Goldblatt is the only rabbi I know who has a town named after him. Danville, California, which is where he lives and works and has been rabbi. If you believe that, don't. But he has been rabbi at Congregation Beth Chaim for the past 30 years, and in 3 days, he is retiring. Boy, I can't imagine being anywhere for 3 minutes sometimes. But kol hakavod, Rabbi Dan, just a little bit about you. And I forgot to put Shulamit's website into the chat, but I'll do that as well. I'll put all the storytellers' websites in the chat so you can learn a little bit more about them if you would like. Rabbi Dan serves on the boards of Ohala, the Association of Rabbis for Jewish Renewal. You were one of the very first people that I met when I started coming to Ohala, and I hope I'm not embarrassing to say that you're one of the kindest people I've ever encountered in all my life. And you're also the past president of Ohala, so you have served Jewish renewal, and you're also a musmach of Reb Zalman, yes? So without further ado, I think that Reb Zalman and I are looking forward to the story that you're about to tell.
Thank you, Mark. Good Yontif. Hi lai la lai, hi lai la lai, hi lai la lai 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 lai, hi lai la lai, hi lai la lai, hi lai la lai 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 lai. Dance has always been an important pathway to mystical experiences in my life. Growing up, one of my favorite moments of the year was always Simchat Torah. I know we're here entering into this space of Shavuot, but to me, the Torah reverberates between these chagim. My siblings and I went to the Hebrew Academy of Cleveland, a feeder into Tel Yeshiva, whose rabbanim escaped from Lithuania during the war and reestablished the yeshiva in a suburb of Cleveland. On Simchat Torah, the sanctuary was packed with people shoulder to shoulder. When the dancing started, if you were in the room, you were dancing, because the wooden floor was moving up and down with the weight of bodies flying across the room. Hoshia et amecha, uvarech et nachlatecha, urem, 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 urem v'nasim, ad olam. The dancing was the most intense experience of passionate dvekut, losing oneself in the communion with the divine. We would often dance for 5 or 6 hours, way past exhaustion, into an expanded state of consciousness that I had no words for as a child, but I loved it so deeply and looked forward to it every year. Fast forward to the fall of 1975. I was in Jerusalem on my junior year abroad. My habit was to attend a different shul in Yerushalayim on Shabbat and the Chagim. I had heard that Heichel Shlomo, the original seat of the Israeli rabbinate, was the place to go on Simchat Torah, not necessarily because of what happened inside the shul, but rather that it was the meeting place for all the shuls in the center of town, in the center of Jerusalem. The word was that people would gather outside in a large traffic circle, closed on the holiday, of course, in front of the King's Hotel, to dance, to dance, to dance. So I went to Heichel Shlomo, and the Shachrit and Torah service was lovely. We broke into Hakafot, Freilach circles inside the shul. When the service ended, the Torah was taken out of the building and the dancing began in the large circle. Mipi el, Yivarach Yisrael. Mipi el, Yivarach Yisrael. Ein adir kadonai, ve'ein baruch keven amram. Ein gdola keTorah, ve'ein dorsha keYisrael. Yes, the dancing. The dancing. Groups from nearby synagogues arrived with their Torah scrolls, their Sifrei Torah, and soon there were many hundreds of people dancing with the Torahs. The tradition was that when the Torah was outside, several people held a talit over the Torah as it was being danced around the circle. After about an hour of dancing, someone decided that it was time to move down to the Ir Hatikah, the old city in front of the Kotel. I was handed a corner of a talit covering one of the Sifrei Torah, and we began dancing down Agron Street toward the old city. As we moved through what was then a light industrial, somewhat poor residential part of the city called Mamila, there were sukkot built on the mirpasot, the balconies on each side of the street. And on the afternoon of the Chag, the sukkot were filled with people. There were wild ululations and showers of candy that poured down on us as we danced toward the old city. Soon, we reached Shar Yafo, Jaffa Gate, and entered the ancient holy city. It was as if we had gone back in time, transported into a different reality. As we danced down the main thoroughfares of the Shuk, the Arab vendors, the shopkeepers looked at us with quizzically and were eager to have us pass so that they could continue selling their wares to the bewildered tourists. After the main part of the Shuk, we took a right turn and headed into the Rova HaYehudi, the Jewish quarter, and again, Sukkot appeared overhead on all the balconies. There was singing above and below, and we danced on the smooth stones, the ancient stones, as our ancestors had done for countless generations. The tight quarters gave way to an expanse as we moved toward the immense square approaching the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the Western Wall. There were already thousands of people dancing in front of the Kotel, in streams coming from 3 directions. Men dancing with Torahs, a confluence of streams of humanity fully alive and inspired with the Ruach and profound joy of this holy day of celebration. While smaller circles of dancing were happening as tens of thousands of people, the paper the next day estimated over 100,000, filled the large area in front of the Kotel. Several people seemed to be organizing this chaotic, buzzing, massive beehive of people. Many of the Torah scrolls had been placed on tables near the Kotel. There were 4 Torahs being held by individuals. One of them was the Torah I had helped hold the talit over as we danced down from Heichel Shlomo. All at once, there was one song ringing out. Ana Adonai Hoshiana, Ana Adonai Hatzlichana, Anenu, Anenu Biyom Korenu, Anenu, Anenu Biyom Korenu. The melody was picked up by circle after circle and moved across the large gathering, and everyone was singing it at the top of their lungs. The men, holding the 4 Torahs at the center, each began dancing away from the center, and the large crowd behind each of these men danced backwards. It was like a large empty square had opened up in the middle of the throng. Then, when it seemed like there was no more room for the compressed mass of people, the men holding the two of the Torahs facing each other would begin to dance wildly towards the middle. The crowds behind these two men would dance and sing behind them. Be'ha'erenu betoratecha ve'dabek libeinu b'mitzvotecha ve'yached libeinu le'ahva u'lira et shemecha. As the two Torah scrolls approached one another, the men carrying them would begin to leap into the air, defying gravity, holding the scrolls above their heads, and singing reached a fever pitch. When the two men came together, they would abruptly whirl about, as if turning on the men they had led into the middle, and all the men would turn and head back from where they came. When the men were backed up as far as they could go, the two men holding the Torah on the other sides of the square would begin dancing towards their center, just as their counterparts had done. It was like a giant accordion of humanity pressed together from opposite directions. When it was fully pulled back, another one from the two opposite directions would fill this space and then contract, back and forth, with new songs being sung at maximum volume that this sea of impassioned beings could generate. I don't know how long we were dancing, but every so often the men who were holding the four Torahs would pass them to other people. And the incredible movements of masses of people would continue in this wild, organic fashion. Now, from the beginning, I had been near the front of one of the four moving walls of bodies, and at some point, without any preparation or movement on my part, one of the Torahs was thrust into my hands. I was wholly unprepared, but I accepted the honor. And when the large groups on the other axes danced back, I knew it was my turn to lead my quadrant of ecstatic dancers towards the center. Lifted up by the current of song and energy, I danced forward. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. With no intention and no will of my own, I leapt into the air, hurtling higher than I had ever jumped, notwithstanding the Torah being held in my arms, each hand on an Eitz Chaim. Actually, it felt as if the Torah was propelling me forward, lifting me off the ground, taking me higher. I did not look down to check my landing. The Torah seemed to be communicating with the earth below, urging it to reach up and catch my feet as they returned from their flight. I cannot tell you how long I held the Torah, how long I led the thousands behind me, but I do have a clear memory of leaving my body and ascending. Without any warning, I was given a view of the proceedings from way up in the air. I was looking down on this hypnotic movement of pure ecstasy. I saw myself leaping and dancing with a look on my face that was pure bliss. I could hear the sound as if it was far away, and there was an inner calm that I had never experienced. Just as quickly as I had ascended, I was back in my body, and the volume was back on full blast. When I danced the men in my sprawling column back away from the center, I was guided to hand off the Torah to another person who joyfully received it and continued this sacred, wild dance. when the energy was fully expressed. Again, this was all occurring in timeless time, sacred time, completely without regard to normal temporal categories, with no apparent directive. The dancers dispersed. I suddenly realized that I and everyone else around me were drenched in sweat. We all had these amazing smiles plastered on our faces, and no one seemed able to speak. People wandered around the Kotel Square. I stood stock still, trying to process what had just occurred. These words seem incapable of capturing the enormity of the experience. All I know is that when I made my way back to my apartment, I was flush with fever and slept for most of the next 2 days. Friends asked me how I had spent Simchat Torah, and I found myself saying that it was simply the most beautiful Chag I had ever experienced. So on this Tikkun Leil Shavuot, I honor the power of the Torah to lift us up, to transform our lives in ways that are beyond the beyond. Me'al u'me'ever.
והריננו בתורתך ודבק ליבנו במצוותיך ויחד לבבינו לאהבה וליראה את שמך. Thank you, Rabbi Dan. I couldn't decide whether or not to sing Defying Gravity from Wicked, or singing V'har Erinenu. But I think V'har Erinenu covers it all. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for being here this evening with us. You can well imagine that many more people register for events than show up at those actual events. I'm one of those people, and I suspect you are too. I think we had upwards of 75 people register for this evening, and we're around 55 or so. A person once asked a wealthy man for a loan. This was a substantial amount of money. This man wanted to go into business. And after a great deal of pleading with this rich man, the rich man told the borrower, okay, I will lend you the money, come to my home tonight. All that evening, the rich man waits at his home. And the borrower never shows up. What's going on? Well, would you believe that the next day the very same thing happens? The borrower goes to the rich man and asks him to lend his money. I told you yesterday that I would lend you the money, and I waited for you all last night, and you didn't show up. The man, he apologized. And again, he pleaded the rich man for the money. He says, we've got a deal, don't worry, just come tonight. But again, you can guess it. The borrower did not appear. And when the man came for yet a third time to the rich man to ask for the loan, the rich man got angry. He says, this is narishkeit. This is foolishness. I've offered you the money. I sat in my home and for 2 nights waiting for you, and you didn't show up. If you don't want the money, why do you persist in asking for it? So, you asked for the link, you registered, and here you are. And I am grateful for that. And I pray that you take a lot from this evening and then pass it on and pass it on so that the loan of these gifts, of these stories, become your stories to tell after this evening. Rick Stone. Rick Stone is a moshnik, as well as Shulamit. What do I mean by a moshnik? He shows up every Shabbos morning and other times during the week to daven with us here at Minyan Oneg Shabbat in the Zumagog. Rick, where's your, there it is. You're a nationally known speaker. Well, I know you. And you talk about the power of storytelling, and you have wonderful books, and you live in Decatur, Georgia, as I said before, with your wonderful, lovely wife, Elizabeth, also a Moshnik. So please, everyone, welcome, with the fire behind him, Rick Stone.
Thank you, Rabbi Mark. So tonight I want to share with you a story that I've been living with for the last almost 2 years. And it has been a project of love and labor to tell the story of two people, actually a whole group of people, that's really not very well known here in Georgia, nor around the world. So, Rabbi Mark, if you could throw up that first image. Thank you. So, if you were to go to Savannah, Georgia, and you were wandering around the streets and maybe wandering down Oglethorpe Avenue near Bull Avenue, you would come across this monument. And it's hidden, it's there in the sort of the median between the two ways of traffic. It's reset. You could almost walk past it. And what's odd about this monument is it has the name of James Edward Oglethorpe on it and a Jewish menorah. And James Edward Oglethorpe was not Jewish. He was certainly Church of England, but he was the founder of the colony of Georgia. Go to the next image, if you would, Mark. But if you walk around that monument, you will find these two brass plaques. And these are the names of 17 or so Jews that we know are probably buried right there at that intersection of Oglethorpe and Bull Avenue. So I want to tell you the story about these people and how did they come to be there? And it is a story of exile, a story of Exodus, and a story of arriving at a new Canaan, a new world. And my cat has decided to arrive at this very moment and participate. Yes, I hear you, Rafi. So to understand this story, we have to go back to 1391. In Spain. And Spain at that time, was at the heart of the whole Jewish world. There were more Jews who lived in Spain than any other part of Europe or the Mideast. And it was the thought center. There were great philosophers, great doctors, great poets, great artists. It was a place that was vibrant. But in 1391, there was a massacre, a pogrom in Spain, and thousands of Jews were killed, and probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 Jews converted to Catholicism. There were probably at that time somewhere around 600,000 Jews total in Israel. Hold on one second. Yes. Okay. And so this was obviously a tragedy, and I'm going to ask this cat to leave. Hold on one second. No, he's leaving on his own. So this was obviously a tragedy, and but not much changed because all these Jews lived among the conversos, those who became new Christians lived among the Jews, and many of them continued to practice Judaism quietly in their own ways. Then 1492 came along, and we all know 1492 is the day that, yes, I hear you, the date that Columbus, hold on one second.
Yai rai 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 yalai ai 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 rai yalalai rai rai yalai rai 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 yai ai 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 yalai rai 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 yai ai 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 yai ai 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 ai. I was singing the nigun of the cuts the Ketske Rebbe, the Katz Rebbe.
So 1492 comes along, and Columbus sails, obviously, for the New World. But in 1492, the Catholic rulers decided that there should be no more Jews in Spain. There were about 400,000 at the time. 200,000 were conversos. So 600,000 total. About most of them left. A few were killed, and many of them converted. And about 30,000 Jews ended up going to Portugal next door, where they were welcomed. And because they brought their gold and their commerce, and they became part of the Portuguese society. But 5 years later, in 1497, the King of Portugal decided it would be a very good thing to make a shidduch between his son and the daughter of Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain. And they were very happy about that, except they had one condition. And that condition was that there be no Jews left in Portugal. So this was a bit of a dilemma for the King of Portugal. He didn't know quite what to do. He did not invite the Jews to leave on their own. He invited them to come to Lisbon, where he told them that there would be ships waiting for them to take them to England. But when they arrived, there were no ships, and he had no intention of letting them go. And he held their children hostage. And in one day, 30,000 Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism in 1497. So there were no more Jews left in Portugal, and so his son could marry the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. And in many ways, this period has been seen as probably comparable to the Babylonian exile. And this was an awful event, I think, in the history of the Jewish people. And the consequences of it continue to reverberate throughout the world. So generations go by, and there were exiles. Jews were exiled from other countries, but there were very small numbers. Jews were forced to leave England in 1290. They were not allowed back until Cromwell allowed them back in 1656. They were forced out of France. But generations go by, and many of these converso families begin to integrate very well into the Portuguese society. And we pick up with the two people, Diogo Nunes Ribeiro and Gracia Catana de Vega, his wife. And in 1703, the Inquisition is at full force, and they are accused of Judaizing. And the Inquisition was such that anyone could accuse anybody. And you didn't have to be a converso to be accused. You could be a good standing Catholic to be accused. And unlike our justice system, where you're innocent until proven guilty, there you were guilty until you were proven innocent. And if you were innocent, it didn't matter, because you would be tortured to the point where you would admit whatever they wanted you to admit. But some people resisted. So Diogo and his wife Gracia are arrested and for Judaizing. And they were reported actually by relatives and friends, because there was always money involved. There was often a bounty, very similar to what's happening in our country in Texas today around abortion, where people can receive a bounty for reporting their neighbors. And Diogo does not do well with the torture and quickly admits that he's been Judaizing. His wife, though, resists. And finally, though she is released in 1706, there's an auto de fe, which means act of faith. These were events in which people who were accused of being heretics, they would have to wear yellow gowns with red crosses on them, and they would be paraded around town and humiliated. And they often would find that all of their possessions had been repossessed. And so she and her husband, Diogo, are finally released in 1706. And it looks like their lives are over, but they begin to rebuild their lives. He's a very gifted physician. And within about 10 or 15 years, he finds his way back up into society in Portugal. And he is such a gifted physician that the new Inquisitor General invites him for a conversation, because he has an illness that none of the other doctors have been able to address. And it turns out Diogo is able to diagnose it and treat him. And within a very short time, he is now ministering to the nobility of Portugal and finally the King of Portugal. He's risen to the very upper echelons of society. And in 1726, though, he's accused again of not just Judaizing, he's accused of assisting other conversos to escape to England. And what's interesting, when he's arrested on Passover. And his family is secretly celebrating Passover in their basement when the police come to arrest the whole family. This is the problem for the Inquisitor General. One, Diogo's got friends in high places. Two, he needs his medical assistance, and so he strikes a bargain with Diogo. No more Judaizing, no more assisting other conversos, but he doesn't trust him. So he places two priests to live in his house to keep an eye on him and his family. And this is sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. It's untenable for his family. And Diogo is able to engineer their escape in 1726 on an English mail ship on the night of Pentecost. And it's a longer story. We don't have time to tell that story, but they escape to England, and they end up at Bevis Mark Synagogue, which is the Sephardic synagogue there. And they decide that they're going to not convert, but revert to Judaism. But not so easy. None of the men have been circumcised, so they have to go through circumcision. For Gracia, his wife, who had felt like she was an equal among all the people, all the kinds of the men, and in terms of religious practice, suddenly found herself to be not so equal in her experience, which was a common experience for many conversos, and especially the women who had been leading the services all this time. They were the ones who kept alive the light of Judaism for all these generations in their basements. And now she was not the one who was to be doing the praying, it's the men. And at some point, she actually got pregnant in her 50s, and the baby did not survive. And by Jewish custom, the baby was quickly buried and without a headstone. And this also was a very disturbing event for her. So she became more and more disenchanted with Judaism, while Diogo became more and more engaged. The problem was his sons, they could not find work, meaningful work. And with time, they began to experience what would have been, the word anti-Semitism had not even been kind of invented at that point, but they began to experience that they were being marginalized. At this time, there was a man named James Oglethorpe, who was a very wealthy, came from a wealthy family, but his parents were Jacobites. That's another long story. But he had allied himself with King George, and he became sort of convinced that there was a problem in the country. He had a dear friend who was an architect who had been arrested because he owed someone £5. And in those days, they had debtor prisons in England, and you could be arrested on any kind of accusation if you owed £5 and thrown into jail until you could repay it. And not only were you thrown into jail, but you had to pay for your own food. You had to pay for your bribes to all the jailers. And he had no money on himself, this man Castell, and so he was thrown into a cell with 40 other men who had smallpox. And by the time word got out that he was arrested and Oglethorpe went to try to bail him out, he had died from smallpox, and Oglethorpe was outraged and ended up leading a whole change of the laws in Parliament around debtor prisons, and became inspired to create the Georgia colony, a place where poor people could go and actually be given land and a new beginning. And there were 3 very wealthy Jews in England at this time. Jews had been allowed back in 1656. One was a director of the Bank of England, another director of the East India Trading Company. And they were invited to participate with the other trustees to raise money for this new colony, until the other trustees got wind that they had other intentions. They wanted to send all their poor Jews to Georgia as well. And this did not sit well with the other trustees, and they revoked their commissions, said, "We want the money back." And the commissioners, the Jewish commissioners said, "Forget it." They didn't even respond. And they went and got their own boat. And they went to Diogo Nunes Ribeiro and said to him, now he's been renamed Samuel, and his wife is now Rebecca, asked him to lead a mission of 42 Jews to go to the colony of Georgia. And in 1732, Oglethorpe departs, And the colony of Georgia was a unique experiment. It was a social experiment in many respects. Not only were there, it was a place for the poor, but there were to be no slaves. And Oglethorpe was really one of the first anti-slavery individuals in England. It became a strong opponent to slavery and prohibited slavery within the colony. And it was supposed to be a place for Protestants who were being persecuted in Europe to come, and there's a whole story with that. There was no mention in the codicils about no Jews, but there was a mention to no Catholics. So Oglethorpe comes, and then the Jews show up 5 months later after a horrific trip. And there is Diogo Nunes Ribeiro on the shores of the Savannah River confronting Oglethorpe. And Oglethorpe is saying, "Who are you people and what are you doing here?" And he discovers that they're Jews. And he has a problem because the trustees had expressed their desire to have no Jews. And what was he to do? And he also had another problem. There was an epidemic, probably yellow fever raging. 20 people had died. Half the colony had fevers. The doctor had died. And here among the Jews was a doctor who said, "I know what to do to cure your people." And he had to make a decision. And he made the right decision. He allowed the Jews to come ashore. He allowed them to buy land. And it was really the first concerted effort in the colonies to really embrace the Jewish people. And that changed the future of Savannah. It changed the future of the South and also of America. So that is the story of Diogo and Gracia Nunes Ribeiro.
Ooh, thank you, Rick. Torah tziva lanu Moshe morsha kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu Moshe morsha kehilat Yaakov. Tziva lanu Moshe. Come on, Moshniks. Tziva lanu Moshe morsha kehilat Yaakov. Tziva lanu Moshe. Tziva lanu Moshe morsha kehilat Yaakov. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, la, la, da, da, na. Ay, la, 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 da. Ay, la, 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 la. Ay, la, la, ya. Ay, la, 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 la. Ay, la, 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 la. Ay, la, 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 la. Ay, la, la, ya. By the light, by the Torah's eternal light, 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 yai la la la, yai la la, yai la la, yai la la, la 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 la, di da da da. A shtickele Torah. What did Israel hear at Sinai? Rav Mendel of Rimanov, 19th century Hasidic Rebbe, teaches that the first letter of the first word of the first commandment, that is, we heard nothing more than the silent aleph of Anochi, I am. Gershom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar of Jewish mysticism and Chassidut, teaches on Reb Mendel's teaching the following. To hear the aleph is to hear next to nothing. It is the preparation for all audible language, but in itself conveys no determinate specific meaning. Thus, with this daring statement that the actual revelation to Israel consisted only of the aleph, Reb Mendel transformed the revelation on Sinai into a mystical revelation, pregnant with infinite meaning, but without specific meaning. Reb Zalman of blessed memory teaches that a good maisa, a good story, is one where the brain surprises the heart. And I want to add to that too, that a good story is one that is infinite, that is pregnant with infinite meaning, but without specific meaning. In the same way that divinity was speaking to you and you and you and you, to each one of us, and each of us drew our own understanding when we stood at Sinai together. Standing next to me and waiting to slip into my seat is the most wonderful storyteller that I know. I have to say that because we live together. It's, of course, my wife, Renée Brachfeld.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everybody. Okay, let me get myself ready here. This story I learned when I was living in Spain. It's a Spanish folktale, and I actually was just thinking as Rick was talking about the expulsion from Spain, that one of the things I love about Spanish folktales is they're often little tiny places within them where you hear something that you think, oh, that came from a Jewish story. And they're sort of little secrets waiting to hit you. This story is called, in Spanish, El Peral de la Tía Miseria. If it was in English, you would call it Aunt Misery's pear tree. But because I first encountered this in Spanish, I always think of the protagonist of the story in her Spanish name, Tía Miseria, so that's what I'll call her. Tía Miseria was a poor old woman. She lived alone in a little hut at the edge of town. She was very poor, and she had no one to take care of her, and no one to take care of. And some days she so lacked any food to eat that all she could do was go into town and put out her hand and collect what coins and crumbs and crusts of bread that the people were willing to give her. But there was in Tía Miseria's life one thing that gave her great joy. That was the pear tree that grew in her yard. Oh, she loved that pear tree. She loved the tree, and every year she would wait and wait until those pears were ripe. She'd watch them grow, and when they were ready, she would pick the pears and bite into them, and the golden juice would run down her chin and drip onto her dress, and she wouldn't even care because they were the most delicious things she'd ever tasted. Tía Miseria loved those pears, and that tree brought her so much joy. In her hard life, it was this one shining thing that gave her so much pleasure. And she would eat all the pears that she could, except that every year there was one thing that spoiled the pleasure she had in that pear tree, and that was the boys that lived in the village. Because as soon as they heard that the pears were ripe, they would come to Tía Miseria's yard, and they would climb up into the tree, and they would just ruin the rest of the crop. They would throw the pears at each other. They would drop them on the ground. If Tía Miseria came to yell at them, they would throw them at her. They would taunt her, calling her, Tía Miseria, until she got so angry and frustrated she'd go back inside. They really spoiled the pleasure she got from that tree. But every year, she waited eagerly for the pears to get ripe, and she ate what she could before they came and spoiled it. One winter, long before the pears had even begun to form on that tree, late in the winter, towards the spring, but not there yet, it was a dark, cold evening. There was some snow beginning to fall, and the wind was blowing, and Tía Miseria heard a knock on her door. She wasn't expecting everyone all alone there in her hut, and she went to the door and opened it. And there, standing in the doorway, was a shivering little beggar man. And Tia Miseria, she was moved to pity by this man standing there dressed in rags in this cold night. And he said, Tia Miseria, please, please, I've been knocking on doors and no one will let me in. I'm so cold and I'm hungry. Please let me in. Well, of course, she opened the door. She drew him inside. She wrapped him in a blanket and sat him down by the fire. She'd been about to eat a meager little meal, just enough for herself. But she looked at this poor, hungry, shivering man, and she took that meal and divided it into 2 parts, and she gave the larger share to the little beggar man. Oh, he was so happy to be there in the warmth and with companionship, eating. The 2 of them had a good time talking to one another. And then when the meal was over, she wouldn't let him leave. She said, it's freezing cold outside. You can't leave into this cold night. And she took the pile of straw, which was all she had for a bed, and divided it into 2 parts. It gave the larger share to the beggar man, put it right near the stove so that he could sleep safe and warm. And before he left the next morning, the beggar man turned to Tia Miseria and he said, Tia Miseria, I knocked at house after house yesterday and no one else would let me in. You brought me inside into your warmth and you gave me your food. You've taken such good care of me. I would like to thank you for your generosity. I tell you what, I can grant wishes. I can grant you a wish. You tell me what you'd like and I will grant it for you. Tia Miseria. She looked at this little beggar man and she thought, look at him. He's a beggar man. He doesn't have anything he could give me. What could he possibly give me? He's got nothing. But she didn't want to say that out loud and embarrass him. So she just said, thank you. That's very kind of you, but I'm really okay. I don't need anything. No, said the beggar man, you don't understand. I know I look like a beggar man, pero no lo soy. That's not what I am. I can do what I say. I can grant you a wish. Just tell me what you want. Well, again, she didn't want to embarrass him, but she thought of something she could ask for that he wouldn't have to produce. So she said, if you can grant me anything I wish for, I would like you to grant me a special power. I would like you to grant me the power that if anybody climbs up into my pear tree, they get stuck there and they can't get down until I give them my permission. That's what you want, said the beggar man. It's the only thing I want, said Tia Miseria. Very well, said the beggar man. I grant you that power. And then he thanked her again for her kindness, and he left. And she really didn't think about it again. He had left. She got through the rest of the cold weather, and then the warm weather came, and the pears grew ripe. And she got to pick a pear or 2 from the tree, and she ate them, and they were so delicious. It was a moment of pure pleasure. She picked a few of the pears that she could reach from the ground when, you guessed it, the boys, they heard the pears were ripe. They came over to Tia Miseria's house. They climbed up into her tree, and they did what they always did. They had pear fights. They threw pears at each other. They picked them and dropped them on the ground. They taunted her. And then she heard them calling. But they weren't taunting. It wasn't the taunting voice. They were calling for her. They were yelling, Tia Miseria, please help. And when Tia Miseria went outside, she saw the boys in the tree, and they said, Tia Miseria, something's wrong. We can't get out of the tree. And she was puzzled for a moment until she remembered the beggar man. The boys were stuck in the tree, and she said, that's right. She watched them as they pulled and they tried and they tugged, but they couldn't get out of the tree. She said, you can't get out of that tree until I give you my permission. Well, Give us your permission then, said the boys. No, said Tia Miseria, and she went back into her house. Well, the boys pulled and tried and tugged, but they were stuck in that tree. And they called her again and again until finally she went outside. And they said, Tia Miseria, please let us out of the tree. She thought about it, and she said, if I let you out of the tree, do you promise that you will never come and steal my pears again? Oh, we promise, they said. We promise, just please let us out. If I let you out of the tree, do you promise that you will tell everybody else and you won't let anyone else who's not here today come and take my pears? You'll make sure that the pears are safe. We promise, said the boys. Just please let us out of the tree. If I let you out of the tree, she said, do you promise that you'll come to my house every year and you'll help me take care of the tree and tend to the yard and pick the pears that are too high for me to reach? We promise, said the boys. Just please let us out of the tree. I'll think about it, said Tia Miseria. She went back into her house. She did let them out of the tree. Hours later, when she felt good and ready to. And the boys, they kept their promise. They never came and stole her pears again. And they made sure no one else did either. And every year, they came to her yard. They helped her take care of the tree and tend to the yard. And they even climbed up with her permission and picked the high pears and put them into baskets and handed them down. She got so many pears then that she had too many pears to eat. She would let the boys take them home to their own houses. And over the years of working together, those boys and Tia Miseria, they got to be friends. And life was much better than it had been, all those pears. And years passed, as years do. And one night, Tia Miseria, she'd grown quite old by then. She was alone. It was late in the pear season. And she had a lot of pears to eat, but she'd finished them all. And she was sitting there. It had gotten quite dark. There was a knock on the door. And Tia Miseria went to the door. And there, standing in the doorway, there was a tall figure, tall and thin, dressed all in black. Tia Miseria had never seen her before, but she knew who it was. It turns out that that night, death had come to call on Tia Miseria. In Spanish, they call her La Muerta. In English, we just call her Death. And Death reached out one long, skinny finger and beckoned to Tia Miseria. Death said, Tia Miseria, your hour has arrived. Come with me. Tia Miseria, your time has come. Come with me. Tia Miseria, come with me. Well, Tia Miseria had not been expecting Death on this particular night, alone in her house during the pear season. She wasn't at all prepared. And she said, Death, wait, I wasn't thinking you were coming tonight. Could you wait for just a minute? I have to put some things in order. Come inside and wait. Just let me organize my house. I don't want to leave it such a mess. All right, but I don't have much time, said Death. And they went inside. Death sat uncomfortably and watched as Tia Miseria bustled around the room. And then Tia Miseria had a thought. And she said, Death, the journey you're about to take me on, it's rather long, is it not? It is, said Death, rather long. We might get hungry along the way, said Tia Miseria, might we not? We might, said Death. I have a pear tree, said Tia Miseria. It gives the best pears. You would love it. Could I just go pick some pears from the tree, and that way we'd have these beautiful, delicious pears to eat while we took the long journey? It'll just take a minute. All right, said old woman said Death, who was getting impatient at this point. There was much work to do. And Tia Miseria picked up her basket and went out into the yard, and Death followed close behind, not knowing what she was about to do, thinking Death better keep a good eye on her before she ran off. Tia Miseria took her basket and went over to the tree and looked up. But of course, all the pears that were within reach had long ago been picked. There were only pears up in the high branches, so Tia Miseria turned to Death and said, Death, I can't reach the ones up in the tree, but they're so good. You would definitely like them. Would you climb up and get the pears? All right, old woman, but we have to get on our way. And Death took the basket, climbed up into the tree, filled the basket with pears, handed it down, and then Death tried to get out of the tree. But it turns out that the beggar's spell was still in effect. Death was stuck in Tia Miseria's pear tree. Death pulled and tried and tugged, but there was nothing for it. There was no way to get out of the tree. Old woman, I don't seem to be able to get out of the tree. That's right, said Tia Miseria. You can't get out unless I give you my permission. Well, give me your permission then. No, said Tia Miseria, and went back into the house. And Death was just outraged and yelled and shouted all kinds of terrible things, but Tia Miseria was adamant. She wouldn't let Death out of the tree. And from that moment, strange things began to happen. Death was stuck in Tia Miseria's pear tree. And so that night in town, at the tavern, there was a fight. A knife was produced. A man was stabbed. The wound looked surely fatal, but that night, that man did not die. He couldn't die because Death was stuck in Tia Miseria's pear tree. At the hospital, there was a noticeable change. There were people who were ill. There were those who were injured. There were some who looked like they would not make it through the night. But that night, at the hospital, nobody died. They couldn't die because Death was stuck in Tia Miseria's pear tree. All over the world, this became something of a problem. Hospitals, they were used to getting beds freed up by the passage of some of their patients, and now that nobody died, the hospital nearby, it was filled to overflowing. In fact, the doctors became distressed. They finally brought all the patients who they had expected Death to come for over to Tia Miseria's house. A whole group began to gather under the tree. Days went by. Tia Miseria, she was unrelenting. They said, please, Tia Miseria, let Death out of the tree, but she would not. This could have gone on for a very long time. But one day, Tia Miseria's oldest friend came to the house and walked with great pain up the steps to her door. And Tia Miseria's friend said, please, Tia Miseria, I'm very old. I'm very tired. I'm ready to go now. Please, let Death out of the tree. And it was really the first time that she had taken into account the fact that although she was not ready to go with Death, there might be others who did not see that visit as such a bad thing. And so Tia Miseria said to her friend, please wait here. I'm going to go talk to Death. And she went out into the yard and she looked up at that very angry Death who was still up trying to get out of the tree. And Tia Miseria said, Death, if I let you out of the tree, do you promise that you will just take these others and leave me alone? I promise, old woman, just let me out of the tree, said Death. Death, if I let you out of the tree, do you promise that you will just take these others and you will leave me alone? I promise, old woman. Just let me out of the tree. There's a lot of work to do. Death, if I let you out of the tree, do you promise that you will not come for me until I call you 3 times? I promise, said Death. All right, said Tia Miseria. You may get out of the tree. I give you my permission. And Death, at that point, was immediately able to descend from the tree. Death gathered up the souls of those who'd come to wait in Tia Miseria's yard. Death gathered up the soul of Tia Miseria's old friend. And Death hurried off, for a lot of work had piled up while Death was stuck in the tree. But Tia Miseria never did feel ready to call for Death. And Death was waiting to hear from her, calling 3 times. And that's why they say, in that part of the world, that for as long as Death keeps her promise, there will always be misery in our world.
Thank you, Renee. Eitz Chaim hi. It is a tree of life. And I saw in the comments, I think it was from Eliana, who says she's going to go right out and plant a tree and leave it to a clever old woman to come up with a great plan. I want to thank all the storytellers this evening, and I especially now want to thank Rabbi Dan Gordon. Dan, you've been waiting oh so patiently to tell your story this evening. Dan is in Texas, and you have been a rabbi of your synagogue, and please forgive me, I forgot the name of it. Temple Beth Torah, yes, 25 miles north of Houston, in the small Jewish community of Humble. If that is not the best name for a town. And what I know of you, Rabbi Dan, is that you are a sweet storyteller of Israel, and with anava, with great, great humility. So please welcome Dante, Rabbi Dan Gordon.
Thanks so much, Mark and Renee. Not only is it Temple Beth Torah of Humble, Texas, with a silent H, but the address is on Shallow Drive. So we mark in humility. Renee, what a powerful, powerful story. And it just goes to show you, we can't understand death. Chag Sameach, everybody. We're taught that God gave Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses gave it to Aaron and his sons, and Aaron and his sons gave it to the elders, and the elders gave it to the rest. And each retelling must have had some other kind of a way of telling. I was told that Abraham Joshua Heschel said, and the reason why I say I was told was because I didn't hear him say it. But apparently he was attributed to saying, by the time the Torah was translated into Hebrew, it was already Midrash. That everyone who hears it and everyone who tells it brings their own spin. And so this story, the last story of the evening, I call the last story. And some of you might recognize pieces of it. I've adapted it from a story of the Baal Shem Tov. And as I put my stopwatch on, Some of you might recognize it as the bishop and the Baal Shem Tov. My version is a bit different. And the first time I started to work on it and told it, one of my colleagues said, "How could you change the story so much?" And I said, "I don't know how much I've changed the story, but I know how much the story has changed me." There was once a man who was looking for his meaning in life. He wanted to make a difference. And the Talmud says, did you hear that? Someone was doing dishes in the background. I apologize. I'm glad someone's doing dishes. The Talmud says, when you're looking for your mission, find yourself a teacher. And he had heard that the Baal Shem Tov was the greatest teacher of all. The Baal Shem Tov, meaning the master of the good name, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And so he sought out the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov looked at him, looked in his eyes, and said, "Your purpose is going to be through story." And so the man said to the Baal Shem Tov, "Can you teach me about story?" And he took him on as a student. He began to teach him about story. He taught him about technique. He taught him how to use his voice, how to bring his voice into the world, how to get people's attention. He also taught him how sometimes being quiet will get more attention. He taught him about gesture, about movement, about how to dramatically make things happen. And he also taught him about stillness and how that sometimes gains what you need. He taught him about timing, about how to speak quickly when he needs to, how to speak slowly when he needs to, and about the importance of some silence, giving people an opportunity to think. And then he taught him the most valuable thing of all. He taught him how to look into a listener's eyes and try to determine what story they need to hear. And then when the master had taught the student everything about technique, he began to tell them story after story after story, stories that made him laugh and stories that made him cry, stories that made him think and stories that made him ponder, and even stories that confused him. And after many, many, many stories, the Baal Shem Tov said to the student, "That's it. That's all I have. That was the last story. And now, my friend, it is up to you to take these stories and find the people who need to hear them." Well, the student said, "What do you mean? You mean I don't have a home of my own? You mean I'm just to travel around telling stories and no home base?" And the Baal Shem Tov said, "One day you will see what an important task this is. Now go." And so he packed his bags and he began to travel and he began to meet people and he began to share his stories, sometimes to one or two people, sometimes to a big crowd. And he would always remember to look into their eyes, to try to determine what story they needed to hear. And sometimes he nailed it, and sometimes he didn't. But he began to notice that sometimes he would hone in on somebody's eyes and somebody's energy, and then when he got it just right, he would get a smile, a chuckle, a tear, even some applause. And as he kept doing it, he got more and more confident. He felt better and better about his storytelling, and he would sometimes even get a gift, a piece of clothing, a meal, a night's lodging. And then people started to gift him with money. Well, this is working out just great, he thought, and he was collecting money. He was making himself a living from doing what he loved. And one day he went into an inn that he had never been to before, and he announced his presence. "I am a storyteller. I have studied with the great master, the Baal Shem Tov himself. I have stories to tell. Who would like to hear a story? And nobody did. Nobody responded, except the innkeeper, who came up to him and said, every storyteller in the land has been to this inn. We've heard them all before. We are storied out. But have you been to the top of the hill? For there lives a nobleman who will pay for every story that he's never heard before. Well, that's where I'm going, said the storyteller. And he went up to the top of the hill. He pounded on the big door with a brass knocker. A servant came to the door. He told him why he was there. And the servant led him into a great ballroom. And in that ballroom sat the nobleman on a throne. The nobleman said, you're a storyteller? Go on, tell. So the storyteller looked into the eyes of the nobleman. What story will move this man? What's the story that he hasn't heard that he needs to hear? I've got it, he thought. And he told the story better than it had ever been told before. He told her with passion. He told her with energy. He used every nuance and every bit of energy he had. And when he finished the story, the nobleman said, I've heard that one before. Tell another. He looked into his eyes again. Oh, this one will work, I know it. And once again, he told a story better than it had ever been told before. And when he finished this one, the nobleman said, I haven't heard that one before. Here's a coin. Tell another. And he continued to tell story after story after story. And every time he told a story, he would get one of two responses. Either, I've heard that one before, tell another. Or, I haven't heard it before, here's a coin, now tell another. And he kept telling. And he began to get quite a few coins. But what he didn't get was a chuckle, a smile, a tear, a little bit of applause, any kind of emotion. And he wondered, what could I do to move this man? And he's pulling every story he can think of, giving every story every ounce of energy he has. And every time, all he gets is a coin or not a coin, and tell another, tell another, tell another, tell another. And when the storyteller had told everything he could think of, he finally said, that's it. That's all I have. That was the last story. And the nobleman said, you really have no more? Well, here, 5 more coins for your trouble. Now be gone. And the storyteller began to walk away. He counted up his coins, and he realized that he had gotten quite rich that day. But he didn't feel very rich. What could I have done differently, he thought. What could I have done to move this man? This one who clearly wants to hear stories, but none of my stories were the ones that he wanted to hear. Oh my goodness, he thought. I can't believe it. There's one I forgot to tell. Oh my goodness. And he ran right back to the mansion. He ran right past the servant and into the ballroom. And there was the nobleman sitting. And he said, there is one more story. I can't believe I forgot to tell you this one. This was the last story that the master told me before he sent me on my way. This is it. This is the last story. Well, go on, tell it, said the nobleman. Well, it's a real story, he said. It's a story that happened to the master himself. And apparently the story's not finished, but it begins with someone who was watching the Baal Shem Tov, watching from a distance. And when the Baal Shem Tov saw him spying on him, he asked him, what are you doing? And the man said, well, I've been watching you. I saw, when I was a very young boy, I saw the world. I saw how people lived, and I saw how the scholars and teachers, how they lived. And they lived very poorly. And I thought that will never do for me. And I decided right then that I would live my life by doing unto others before they did unto me. And it worked quite well, I have to say. I've become very rich, and I've got businesses, and I've got lots of money, but as rich as I am, I don't feel very rich. And I see the richness that you bring with your teaching and your telling, and I think I'd like to change. The businessman said to the Baal Shem Tov, can you teach me how to change? And the Baal Shem Tov looked into his eyes and said, when the time is right, you will be ready. But this didn't satisfy the businessman. And he said to the Baal Shem Tov, he insisted, how would I know? How will I know when the time is right? And the Baal Shem Tov said, when you hear your own story told to you, the time will be right. Well, as the storyteller said these words to the nobleman, a tear dropped on his cheek, and the nobleman embraced the storyteller and said, the time is right. I'm ready. This night of receiving Torah and receiving stories, if I have one suggestion, it is find your story and tell it. For you never know when the story you need to tell is the one someone needs to hear.
Amen. Thank you, Reb Dante. Are you headed to another Leil Tikkun tonight?
Eventually, yes. It's Central Time here, so I'm going to Chabad. They don't start until.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Renee and Shulamit and Rabbis Dan Goldblatt and Rick Stone for reminding us of the silent Aleph and how rich it is to listen, really listen, and draw our own story from the story. I also want to welcome those of you who are with us for the very first time. If I'm incorrect, please forgive me. Melissa Levy, welcome. And Sarah Schley, welcome. Joe Lauer is here. Joe, I hope the maple syrup is treating you well. Stephen Marcia Glass-Siegel, welcome. It's always good to see you here. Annie Klein. Hi, Annie. Welcome. A lot of wonderful, wonderful Aleph friends gathering this evening. Did I miss anybody here? I think if I missed them, they must have left. So let's end with a song. Of course, this one. Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. Leslie Whitkov, welcome. V'tomcheha me'ushar deracheha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom Hashiveinu Adonai Eilecha v'nashuva Chadesh yameinu kedem. Sing it as a nigun with me. Yalalai rai rai yai 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 yai. Yai 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 rai rai yai rai 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 yai rai rai yai rai rai Hashivenu Eloheinu Adonai, Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh yameinu, kekedem. Chag Sameach, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening.